All right. So you want to take a deep breath or just go?
Yeah, take a deep breath.
Well, welcome everyone. We are so excited that you could join us and you're tuning in for this conversation that we are calling Healing the Parts of Ourselves. I'm Lacey. This is my friend Jared. Hey, Jared.
Hey, everybody.
We are really looking forward to talking about internal family systems as a model and in practice in therapy. So, Jared, I'm jumping right in here. Tell me a little bit about internal family systems and maybe when you first heard of it or how you first encountered it.
Yeah, so first of all, IFS is something that I'm really into, and I draw from the model a lot, but I wouldn't say it's like exclusively what I use. So kind of take a lot of this with a grain of salt. I don't represent, the IFS Institute or anything like that. But I found the internal family systems model to be incredibly helpful. A friend of mine, a colleague that I had been in a consultation group, mentioned it to me in passing, and she really got into it and did the level 1 certification for this type of therapy. And I was always really curious about it because it made a lot of sense to me, and it was something that seemed like it could be really powerful, but it's also very different from a lot of different therapies that people generally gravitate toward, as far as like cognitive behavioral stuff, solution focused strategies, things like that. The other thing I really was drawn to is the idea of there's sort of the spiritual component to it. There's room for mystery, there's room for curiosity and recognizing how complex we are as humans. So that also was something that was really compelling to me. So yeah, I just, started to explore it, read some books, did some trainings, and it's become something that I draw on very heavily in my own practice, and have just seen a ton of success with a lot of people who felt stuck in more cognitive behavioral strategies, like changing your thinking or your perspective, changing your behaviors. And people who felt stuck in some of that stuff have really found a lot of freedom and like feeling like they're getting unstuck using some of the internal family systems model.
Yes, I know it turns some things on its head in terms of how we typically look at different parts of ourselves. Can you talk about how they're getting unstuck or how you see that process happening with IFS?
Yeah. So one of the first things that's important to understand about this model is we are all born with, we call them parts, but it's sort of an imprecise word, but basically like subdivisions of our personalities. And I think we use that language intuitively. I've never had much pushback with clients when I kind of reflect back and say, a part of you would love to go out with your friends, and a part of you wants to just stay home and do nothing. So you start to notice this tension within ourselves. And I think sort of the more orthodox traditional understanding of the mind and the psyche is sort of this unitary thing, with like emotions and impulses sort of like emanating from a singular point. And when we look at emotions and urges like that, it can feel like they're just like things that happen to us and we have to control them. But the internal family systems model says that parts are normal. It's normal to have sort of some separation between these different mental states. And a lot of that has been sort of pathologized in media and literature, and the idea of like multiple personalities and people talking to themselves, and that being the sign of being really mentally ill. But IFS starts with the idea that people with multiple personalities, it's called dissociative identity disorder now, people with that diagnosis aren't crazy. It's just that there are more extreme breaks between these parts, whereas people most people have sort of an ebb and flow. I might find myself in a certain environment. Like I have a part of me that loves playing basketball. And so when I'm like in that part, like that blueprint in my nervous system gets activated and I know exactly what to do. And
Mhm.
then like I'll shift to a setting where I'm with friends and, talking about something deeply personal. And that's going to be a different part of me that sort of engages in that social setting.
Mhm.
So we can see these like distinct parts of our personality
Yeah.
and how each has a job to do, each has a function. So it's not that that is like pathological. It doesn't mean that there's something broken in you. There's just a little bit more of a separation and less of an ebb and flow with people who have what we call dissociative identity disorder. So
Mhm.
I can see my basketball part, and I can see my angry part that gets upset at like injustice or things like that. So we look at these parts and we recognize that like if we're sort of like born this way, that we are created
Mhm.
to sort of like be an internal community, that there's sort of like these different voices, these different thoughts, urges, jobs. We look at those parts as being naturally valuable. So these parts have different jobs, they do different things. What happens is those parts that are valuable and helpful and kind of contribute to our internal system, when we experience pain, when we experience trauma, when we experience stressful events, when we experience ruptures in relationships, especially attachment relationships with parents or caregivers when we're younger, those parts of us basically take on these more extreme roles in
Mhm.
order to protect us, to prevent bad stuff from happening again. And so those parts kind of get forced into these roles that they don't necessarily want to do. Your brain makes basically like blueprints of these experiences, and when it gets activated, it's like you go back in time and are sort of like frozen there.
Mhm.
So a lot of what trauma is we are experiencing a neural network, and everything that happens with it, from a previous point, but we can only live in the present, obviously. So
Mhm.
it just gets brought up to the present, and we experience all of that stuff again. So we can experience that fear, we can experience shame, rejection,
Mhm.
all of those things that we carry from those experiences. So there are parts, they have jobs to do. When bad stuff happens, they take on what we call burdens, which are
Mhm.
jobs that they have to do to protect us. And sometimes those jobs are destructive or can cause us problems. But if we recognize that there's a purpose to it, then we can start to see like maybe there's a way for that part to change. And so their burdens are those beliefs like I have to do this certain thing because I had to do it back then. And so our brains just sort of like project out into all kinds of different scenarios. So yeah, these parts of us, we call them protector parts that keep us safe. And then there are parts called exiles, and exiles are the ones that actually carry pain, that carry rejection, that carry shame, that carry fear and grief, and all of those things that are just like super painful to go to. We're afraid it's going to like overwhelm our system. We're going to be overtaken by fear. We're going to be overtaken by pain and shame and all that stuff. So we do our best to get rid of that stuff as much as possible. So one of the things I think a lot of different therapies make a mistake in is they see parts as their burdens. So let's say there's a part of me that gets explosively angry. So an anger management treatment would work on like calming that down. It would work to um, basically go to war with that anger and be like, you need to stop doing that. You need to find ways to manage it. You have to use deep breathing and counting and all this stuff.
Mhm.
Um, but one of the things that I found really revolutionary about this approach is the idea that our parts are not their burdens.
Mm.
So a part is doing that thing, getting really angry, pushing people away, being explosive for a reason. And if we can find out that reason,
Mm.
then we can heal the wound that's underneath, and then that part won't need to protect it anymore. But
Wow.
if we just stay with the anger and say like, okay, I'm going to do some anger management stuff,
Mhm.
you will maybe get that part to calm a little bit.
Yeah.
But if there's a trauma, if there's a wound underneath and you don't get to that, you've really only kind of muzzled this part that's trying to protect you.
Yeah. You've just introduced some rigidity there around it
Hmm.
to contain it.
Right.
What might be a reason underlying somebody's really
Hmm.
explosive outburst?
Yeah. I mean, I hear this all the time. And one of the things that really disarms people is when they come in, they're like, a lot of times it'll be men, it'll be like my girlfriend or my wife, like, are not happy with how angry I get.
Yeah.
And looking at that family system, if whether they're married or not, there's still that family system of like, that's a hard place for the woman to be. And he's trying to like make these changes, and so he kind of ends up coming in thinking like, I'm the problem, I got to figure out my anger. And one of the first things I tell those clients is, I am not I'm not interested in managing your anger.
Mm.
And they'll be like, what do you mean? Like,
Am I in the right
because
place?
I yeah. So yeah, so I'll say like, I'm not interested in managing your anger,
Mm.
because one, I think you could just Google strategies. Like,
Mm.
you don't have to come to a therapist to like, count to 10 and do deep breaths and stuff. You don't need therapy for that. But two, if we manage that part, we won't get information about why it's doing that.
Mm.
So we have to go to it from a place of curiosity,
Curiosity.
of
Yeah.
openness.
Yeah.
And this is a really cool thing that one of the insights of internal family systems that has really resonated with me as a Christian is the idea that there are parts and they have jobs and they do different things, or they're just wounded and they get pushed aside. But there's also this idea of, so in IFS they call it the self, the true self. And the true self is you, like in the current moment. Like, there's only one you that like lives in the present moment.
Interesting.
Your current age. All of these other parts have come from places in the past. In fact, a lot of these parts, like, it sounds weird, but we will ask them like, how old are you? And
Yeah.
how old do you think I am? And the answers people get are just like wild. Like, this part of me like thinks I'm like the 6-year-old kid who needs to be protected. The other core beliefs about internal family systems is this idea that there is a self when these other parts sort of like back up and give you
Mm.
space. There is naturally this self that kind of comes forward and can actually like help bring healing and compassion to these different parts.
What I hear you saying is like there's a self under there that
Hmm.
that's worth bringing forward, because when it's accessed, it could do healing that maybe you
Hmm.
didn't even think you were capable of, which is so empowering too for the
Hmm.
client to feel like, oh, wait, this is coming from me.
So for example, looking at that angry guy, that angry part of this person,
Mm.
and a lot of our parts like hate that angry part of us, because it's like that causes so much destruction. It can ruin my marriage. It can cause a lot of bad stuff in my life. And so there are lots of parts of us that work against that and say like, okay, you got to get out of here, and like, we got to fix you and all this stuff. But the self, our true selves, and as a Christian we call it the image of God, that like reflects goodness and love and even like curiosity towards these parts. So when we ask those parts that hate that angry guy to just like step back for a second, we're not going to let him take over. The goal is not for him to just like do whatever he wants. But if you can just step back a little bit and let me be curious toward him,
Mm.
let's see what he has to say.
immediately in the way you say that, there's like, there's a dignity maybe. Like, I respect
Hmm.
this. Let's ask
Right.
questions of anger. Because
Yeah,
who's done that
exactly.
before? Like, who's
Exactly.
tell me what your anger is doing here.
Right. Which, and the irony is so much of that anger is rooted in nobody asking those questions.
Mm.
So, and I've found like time and time again, clients who have those really explosive, angry parts of them will ask that part, like, how old is this? And they'll sort of get a memory of, being a 4 or 5 year old and just like stomping their feet and like throwing stuff and nobody's listening. Nobody's asking, like, what's going on. Automatically recognizing that, like, it starts to evoke compassion. You start to see, like, it's not this big scary man. That's how he's trying to project to protect himself, but it's actually a little kid that just doesn't know how to get people to hear him. And it's not a belittling, patronizing kind of thing to say, like, oh, this part of you is like a little kid. It's
Mm.
literally what happens in our nervous systems where we just get locked into that mode. And that's how old we are when that happened.
Mhm.
So then we learn, like, okay, if I'm not getting my needs met and people aren't hearing me, then I'm just going to stomp around and like get attention that way.
Mm. Mhm.
So so we look at that and just kind of approach it with that curious compassion and say, like, what's going on for you? I'm not trying to manage you, not trying to make you stop. I'm just curious, like, what's bringing this up? And when we approach a part in that way, they're much more likely to talk. They're much more likely to calm, because it's like, finally somebody is listening. Finally somebody is trying to hear what I have to say. So then we just basically interview them. It's like, okay, like, what is your job for Jeff?
You anger. What is your job
Yeah,
for Jeff?
right.
Mhm.
So, and then, you'll get responses and you just kind of listen to that. Um, and they'll say things like, I'm keeping him protected from people walking on him. I'm keeping him from feeling like he's being unheard, or rejected or lonely, or being treated unfairly. And so we get to know these parts in their jobs, and often we find that these parts don't actually want to do that. They feel like that's their only choice. And I think we all kind of instinctively resonate with that feeling of like, I don't have any other way to control the situation, so I'm just going to explode, and
Yeah.
then people will know that I'm serious.
Yeah.
And so it comes from a place of trying to help, and it comes from a like good intentions, but it often backfires. And
Mm.
so we find these parts and we just start talking to them. It sounds really weird, but it's, these thoughts come from different places. We're basically just listening to the thought and then be like, hey, what if I can dialogue
Mhm.
from my true self with curiosity and compassion, and then see where it takes us. I've never found a part that's unwilling to share that stuff.
Really?
Yeah.
What does resistance look like?
Hmm.
Generally speaking, where do you encounter
Yeah,
resistance in this?
that's a good question. Parts can be aware of each other. So again, it's that same dynamic. So if I approach that angry part of me with sort of like an annoyance or a like pressure for
Oh,
that part to talk, right?
yeah.
It's the same dynamic socially as if I were to approach you in that way. And
Mm.
so we pick up on that from other people, and our own parts pick up on that. So it's like, if you're approaching me with, wanting to manage me, or you're annoyed with me, I'm not going to want to talk to you. It's because they're sensing something that doesn't feel safe, something that doesn't feel like they're being treated with respect and compassion.
Mm.
And so who wouldn't react in that way when we're treated that way? And a lot of times we don't mean to do that. A lot of times it can come from a place of like, I really want to help, but I'm trying to help you from a fixing standpoint.
Mhm.
We've all had experiences like that with loved ones and family, and
Yeah.
where it's like, I want to help, but I'm trying to fix it. And
Yes.
sometimes that doesn't feel good. And
Yes.
sometimes it can feel like, I actually don't want to talk to you anymore about
Yeah.
that.
Well, it's the difference between I want to help you so that you are helped the way I want you to be versus
Right.
I
Right.
want you to discover how you can help yourself.
Right. And so we talk in IFS, we talk a lot about the difference between approaching apart from a part
Mm,
and approaching apart from myself.
mm,
So the self is compassionate, it's kind, it's patient,
mm,
it doesn't judge, it's just open hearted, it can be creative. Like that's who we are when we're not under the strain of difficult circumstances or stress. Like, and so what's really powerful about this therapy, I think, is the idea that everybody has that within them and has access to that. For some people, it's harder to get to that than others. Some
mm,
people have severe trauma histories, and it's really hard for them to get to some of that because they need so much protection. For other people, they seem to have an easier time getting to that. But every human being has that self.
mm.
Every human being has the ability to connect in compassion and all of that stuff. So then you can turn that to start to be appreciative of the angry guy
I
and
love
recognize like, oh, okay, like that actually makes a lot of sense. This
it.
isn't irrational. You're not this irrational, like explosively angry guy. It's just like it's not working so well for you. And so the offer from the therapist and from the client self is like, if you don't actually have to do that anymore. And
Mm,
they'll say, well, why not? And so you say, like, is there a part of you that already feels that way? Is there a part of you that already feels walked over, abused, unheard? And then, like, as soon as you ask that question, like, memories will start popping in. And we start to access the exile. We start to connect with the vulnerable pain underneath
mm,
that protector part. It's obviously a lot more complex than that. And it often takes a lot of negotiating for
mm,
these parts to like trust you to
mm.
go to that more vulnerable stuff.
Yep.
Um, but that's, and then once we gain access to the more vulnerable, like pain and shame, every good trauma treatment incorporates some element of like a detached compassion.
Mm,
The idea that I'm not still in that situation. So, this idea that I have survived whatever the trauma was, whatever that difficult situation was, I survived it and I'm in a place of safety now and I can have compassion for that self that was in that situation. So we start to communicate and access these parts that carry shame, that carry fear, that
mm.
carry the effects of trauma, and
They
we
unburden
begin.
you, unburden. Yeah.
Right. So the idea is that like healing looks like releasing the
Yeah.
extreme emotions, the body sensations, the beliefs that these parts have carried for so long by giving them sort of what we call the nourishing opposite. So you become, as your true self now, you become the person that they needed in those
Mm,
moments that they didn't have.
mhm,
So that little kid whose dad's screaming at him because he can't do stuff right, like we go and like often I've had clients like they're that kid will interact with the kid who's being screamed at, and that kid will want the adult self to come in and be like push him out of here, like get dad out of here, like protect me, like keep me safe. And we do it from a place of compassion for the kid,
mm,
not out of a place of like anger or revenge or anything like that.
yeah,
And that ends up being really healing because it's that part starts to experience like safety, compassion, gentleness, kindness from your current day self.
yeah.
And that can be extremely healing. So then we do what's called witnessing, where we see all of the things that happened. These parts tell the story of what happened, and then we enter those scenes and do for them what they needed in those moments that they didn't get. And what that does is allows your nervous system to basically release all the pent up energy that was never released. And
Mm,
so that's why that stuff gets stuck. And so we're able to release that stuff from those experiences. And then we rescue those parts when they're ready to and bring them up to the present. so they're no longer stuck in those painful experiences. And then we help them unburden from all of those beliefs and those body sensations, and like they just imagine like casting all of that out, like finding in their body, like where did I, feel that anger, where did I feel that fear. Yeah, it's just incredibly powerful. It's incredibly effective. I'm just continually blown away by like how powerful it is for people, and how how much healing I've seen using this model.
Yeah, redemptive is like a word
Yeah, yeah.
that comes up for me. Yeah.
hmm
Like it's not too late to pay attention to
Right,
what happened 40 years
right.
ago. Like it's not too
hmm
late. I have in my mind who would probably maybe would and wouldn't be a good candidate for IFS. And some of the things that come to mind for me are age,
hmm
uh, capacity to reflect, obviously,
Yeah, yeah.
um, sort of like self-regulation, how much of that is already in place. Um,
hmm
but what are your thoughts about who would be like a great fit? What would you say are some things to look out for in yourself that might tell you you'd be a good candidate for IFS?
I mean, I honestly think I work with kids as young as like 13, 14, and I'm always amazed at how introspective they can be if
Mm-hmm.
you create the space for them to do that. I think there's that stereotype of kids being, impulsive and off the wall, and there's some truth to that. But there's also, I think, if you create a space of curiosity, I've just been blown away by what some of these kids have come up with as far as like recognizing these patterns in them, these parts of them that they see. The only burden, or not burden, the barrier I've seen for some people is they feel like they have to like do everything correctly.
I can't relate.
Yep.
I'm not
I'm
perfect
the
at IFS.
right. Yep. I'm the same way. I'm like, because I'll do some consultation stuff with my supervisor. I'm like, this doesn't seem like we're doing it the right way. So like, but even that, like I recognize is just a part of that person who wants to wrap their head around it and wants to be able to understand what they're doing. Because I'm the same way with like intellectual stuff. Like if I understand stuff, it makes me feel better, like I have more control because I can wrap my head around it. And so it's not necessarily a barrier, it's just a part that needs to be attended to and given compassion and sort of normalize. Like that makes sense that this is maybe tricky to kind of do this. And I tell people like there's no right way to do this because there's no wrong way to do it.
Mm.
So there's, if we just kind of like check inside and notice what's there, you're usually going to come up with something.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, honestly, I mean, it sounds sort of like cop out, but I think anybody honestly would benefit from it. I think pretty young kids, they can start to grasp concepts, but I haven't done a lot of work with like really young kids, like under 10.
Mm-hmm. In a sense, you kind of have to like foster. It's weird to think of it this way. So this is not fleshed out at all. So call me out on this, but like first you got to figure out who's on the team. Like
hmm
who you have your sense of self, and then you're also figuring out what does protect you, what is managing your pain, what
hmm
needs to get pushed way back so that other things can come to the front so you can survive or thrive or however we
Right.
describe us
hmm
our growth.
Even my 5-year-old is able to, if she calms, she can pretty clearly articulate like what made you angry.
Yeah.
And even like, what does that do for you? Like, oh, it tells Emery that, she can't take my stuff. Like,
Wow.
okay. So they're like,
Yeah.
there's even like simple, like we think of kids as like really simple minded, and in a beautiful way they are, but also they're very intuitive, which I think is a really important skill or quality in sort of like getting started on this kind of stuff.
So everybody could be helped. There are other theories out there, obviously. And,
Uh-huh.
I was doing a little bit of research and seeing it kind of came in the 1980s through family systems and some pre-existing theories. So
Right.
obviously feels like it's maybe a next iteration or generation of previous theories in therapy, but
Hmm.
what is this I think you mentioned it's not exclusively how you think about your work. Are there other sort of what theories you incorporate, or yeah, what else is there for you when you're working with clients? Other theories or things you borrow from? Uh,
Yeah. I mean, every therapist will tell you that they're eclectic and they like, we all
my
we all
program is
borrow
like,
from
you're not
stuff.
allowed to say that. Like you need to choose something.
Yeah, you're not, even if you are, you can't say it.
Yeah, right.
Um, I found IFS to be sort of the most comprehensive approach
Mhm.
to dealing with mental health stuff, because it incorporates so much. It incorporates a lot of body work, like being aware of like your physical responses to threat, to different relational dynamics. So it's a lot of like the sensory motor, like body awareness stuff. It leaves a lot of space for like our thinking and our beliefs and our behaviors. Um, but it's just sort of, for me, it's been a game changer of looking at it as there's purpose to what we call symptoms.
Mhm.
So it depathologizes a lot of what we call mental health struggles and turns it into like hard stuff happened to you and
Mhm.
you found a way to deal with it.
Mhm.
And some of those ways are great, and some of those ways you're just like wanting to get rid of. So in a sense, IFS kind of incorporates a lot of those different strategies. I think the type of therapy that most people are broadly familiar with is cognitive behavioral therapy, and sometimes they're like, it's interesting. Like if I'm talking to a part of a client that's very intellectual, I end up using a lot of like cognitive behavioral stuff because
Right.
it's sort of like, okay, like where do you get that idea? Like kind of reality testing, evidence, like looking at the thought, and those parts of that client really resonate with that, and it like helps them in a lot of ways. But I think what happens with CBT is we do that with all of our parts. So if there's a part of us that's like really anxious and you try to do CBT, you can maybe get that anxious part to quiet a little bit by
Mhm.
being like, it's okay, like this situation isn't scary. But if that part is rooted in a situation where something very scary did happen, you
Mhm.
can only fact check so much to
Mhm.
sort of reduce the emotion,
Mhm.
because that emotion in and of itself is a warning that something is really wrong here. So it's
Mhm.
sort of like the fire alarm is going off in your house, that's the anxiety.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, I have this goal of making my fire alarm quieter. It's like, okay, like, yeah, that would be great, but why is it going off? And it's
Mhm.
like, I don't know. It's like, oh, okay, well, in the basement, there's stuff on fire.
Mhm.
So we could take the batteries out of the fire alarm. We could like wave the towel over it, see if it stops.
Right.
Um, and that can be effective if your goal is to reduce anxiety. But IFS looks at that and says, like, that's actually valuable information that something underneath is happening.
Mhm.
And if we have curiosity towards that fire alarm of anxiety, we might be able to trace it to where the
Mhm.
fire is, where
Yeah.
the wound is, where the fear is. So yeah, a lot of these different therapies like cognitive behavioral, they're great for some what we would call parts of us, but for others, they don't touch on the powerful emotional experiences associated with anger, depression, anxiety, things like that. And that
Mhm.
was one of the things that, as I started out in private practice, I was basically, everybody does CBT by default, unless you're trained in something that seems more compelling. And I would run into that a lot, like clients that would know all the right answers, knew they had really good perspective on situations, and they were in settings that were safe and they didn't have to worry about it and stuff like that. But that anxiety was always there. And
Mhm.
so, and you always hear people say, like, how do you make, how do you turn something that's head knowledge into like belief or like heart knowledge? Reason and facts and thinking can only get you so far when you're dealing with an emotional reaction that lives in your nervous system that's nowhere near your prefrontal cortex.
Mhm.
So it's, just bouncing off. So yeah, I think there's value in all of that stuff. But again, I think looking at the emotional significance of those experiences is what IFS does really well.
At the beginning, as we started talking about this, you used the example of like part of us wants to go out, part of us wants to stay in.
Hmm.
Very timely. Love that. And we understand indecision behaviorally. But for some reason, emotional maturity, or I don't know if maturity is the right word, emotional awareness starts to
Hmm.
feel like we don't know how to do that, but like we do. And
Yeah.
this is such a great example of like, oh, you do. You can get acquainted with them. Their emotions don't have to work against you. In
Hmm.
fact, maybe they've been working for you this whole time,
Hmm.
but not always to your benefit or the benefit of people in your life.
Right.
Uh,
Or at least trying to get your attention.
Yeah.
And, our emotions are often distressing or uncomfortable. And the last thing we want to do is sit with them.
Mhm.
But if we recognize that, like, there is a self in there who can give compassion and not be overtaken by these parts, in the same way that my daughter can have extreme fear or like a tantrum,
Mhm.
if I stay in that like compassionate curious state, she can feel however she wants. She's not going to overtake me. And
Mhm.
so if we can go with that confidence of being like, okay, this part of me is overwhelmed and I'm feeling it, like it's blending in. I can't, it's hard to control it from doing that, but it can also be really calming for me to just listen. It's like, okay, I see you're trying to get my attention. So what do you need? What's
Yeah,
going on?
I'm listening. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jared. I hope for those who tuned in that it's it feels like, oh, there's possibilities for me. And maybe as they're listening, like, oh yeah, there's a part of me that I don't like
Hmm.
to go to. And there's possibility there for dialogue, for curiosity, for more to be uncovered, that it's not there without any reason at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks to those who are joining in and looking forward to next time we can converse. Jared, if we get a chance to maybe do a demo, we sort of have tossed around some ideas. But thank you so much for being here and for sharing about this model, the internal family systems model.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for having me, Lacey.